An extras POV. Chapter 637 Presence of the Elders. Whispers echoed as Ray, Kara, and Esm trailed behind Gratiana, who led them. The rest of the elves had dispersed, as ordered by their big sis. As a result, they playfully went around the community to see their friends or have fun. Were they worried about their elder? Yes. However, more than that emotion, the excitement they felt was an overriding force for them. They wanted to hate their experiences with the sisters they had in the community. The dungeon experience, their new perspective on nature, and the kind of person the man who just entered the city was. All of this, along with their childlike personalities, made them almost forget Gratiana and her fate, as they trailed off, leaving Ray and his allies to be her only escorts. Or rather, she was theirs. Are you out of your mind? The High Elder's shriek nearly caused all the esteemed elders to wince, despite being used to how hysterical she could be at times. Usually, they would internally caution her to display more decorum and composure, but none of those thoughts were in their mind at the moment. Right now, all the members of the esteemed council couldn't help but agree with the words and actions of the High Elder. All of them were wondering the same thing. Gratiana La Shanagari, one of the most committed of all the elves in the community, had done the one thing that no other rebel had ever managed to do. How dare you bring humans to this sacred place? To our haven? To the bastion of nature? Gratiana stood silent, her hands behind her back as her head was bowed. This reminded her of when she was still a young one and almost gave in to her lust for killing, nearly ripping apart the body of her prey. She had gotten an earful from an esteemed elder at the time, but compared to that, this felt a lot worse. More than anyone, Gratiana understood the severity of her actions. The elven community was a sacred place, filled with the sacred people of nature, the elves. The same way elves couldn't taint themselves by interacting with other races, the elves couldn't allow themselves to be tainted by letting the other races interact with them. For the entirety of their civilization, despite very few elves breaking the first rule traveling to the world of the tainted beings, no one had ever managed to break the second. Yet, she did that. She brought people who would be considered tainted if not abominable to the very heart of their dwelling place. Shame on you, Gratiana. Shame on you. The High Elder spat in anger, sadness, and downright disappointment. The other esteemed elders stared at Gratiana with similar emotions, though the intensity of the respective kinds of feelings differed depending on the elder. One of the elders, however, was an exception. Other than the shock on her face, there wasn't any other emotion that she displayed. High Elder, why don't we let Gratiana explain herself? She isn't one to act in such a manner. After recoiling from the shock, Aurora finally spoke up in defense of her sister. Her gleaming eyes begged for mercy, but most of the esteemed elders scoffed at her words. Wasn't that the same way you were also not one to act in such a manner? Yet you brought disgrace to the esteemed council by leading the youngs under your charge astray as you journeyed to the human world. This again. Aurora sighed, almost in exhaustion. The people in this room never missed any opportunity they had to remind her of her actions. Yes. That again. Do you not realize that it could be because of your reckless actions that an upstanding elder like Gratiana ended up committing such an abomination? Let's hear her out first before making that assumption. Aurora spoke back with a tinge of annoyance, and everyone in the room picked up on it very quickly. With tension high in the room, and the visitors tucked away in an empty abode right outside the Hall of the Elders, The elves present couldn't help but sigh. The High Elder's eyes were moist with tears as she shook her head. Have mercy on these ones, O Oracle of Nature. O Nature! Thou calleth me to thine embrace. A group of elves were huddled together, amidst the devastation that surrounded them. They all held hands tightly, their eyes closed as their quivering lips moved. Save us from tribulation that test our devotion, deliver us into the hands of purity. Their long ears twitched, picking up the loud explosions that rang in several directions. Despite sitting in one of the massive craters, generated by one of such explosions, they paid the whole thing no mind. There was no reason to care any longer. Their bodies were already rotting, poisoned by the tainted poison of miasma. The surplus mana within them had grown corrupt, and there remained no hope for them. All they could do now was pray with the last of their remaining strength, before their bodies become completely paralyzed. Giant flying creatures danced in the sky, raining purplish energies upon the land, creating a bare, infertile surface on the very grounds that once bustled with life. All of this was thanks to the entity that floated far above the flying abominations that did not tire or rest, but constantly rained down destruction and death from their place in the sky. The figure that watched all of this from a distance wore a dark suit, his arms folded as his dark hair swayed with the wind. His azure eyes watched the utter desolation of the elves, seeing as they died, cursed him with their dying breaths, and then prayed before they breathed their last. Even the current elves who prayed had just finished cursing him before engaging in deep prayer, having the image of nature in their minds as they devoted their hearts to the call of nature. They had fulfilled their duties as elves, and it was now time for their glorious rewards. To be one with nature, and before their prayers could be completed, a destructive blast from above descended upon them, utterly consuming them in its power. In a mere instant, they were all dead with not even their bodies left behind. Chapter 638 First Impressions. She brings shame upon us. Misleading the young ones. What in the world was she thinking? The worst part is that those people venture here before everyone. Everyone saw it? How do we explain this? The esteemed elders were speaking among themselves as they analyzed Gratiana's actions, and the sins she committed as a result of her thoughtless decision. They completely ignored the penitent-looking elf before them and discussed very harshly about her, going as far as already talking about potential punishments that could be inflicted on her due to her actions. In elven culture, it was trite that the young ones were hardly punished for their actions. They would always be forgiven and corrected for any act they performed. However, elders were thrust with full responsibility based on any of their actions. They had reached the age of accountability, after all. As such, Gratiana was currently facing the scrutiny of the esteemed elders whose presence she was in. The only one who showed her some semblance of compassion at that moment was Aurora. I now know how you felt back then, sister. Gratiana thought to herself as she saw Aurora's empathetic smile greet her. Even though Gratiana had explained the whole thing to the elders, including her suspicion that the man was no ordinary human, none of them bothered to properly hear her out. Instead, they dug deeper into their biases and kept criticizing her. Even though the man didn't stink, his human partner reeked. You brought such filth here. Right? And then there's that half-elf. Why does she bear such a striking resemblance to her? It makes no sense. Or could it be? Say no more of it. The High Elder suddenly raised her voice as she deepened her frown, causing all of the elders to keep quiet almost instantly. The half-elf is an abomination that deserves death. That is all there is to know about her, and all she will be known for. As the High Elder rose from her seat once more, she walked to the kneeling Gratiana, her eyes a mix of compassion and sheer sadness. You, as an elder, have committed one of the gravest offenses in the history of our people. You must be aware that your punishment will fit the severity of your crime. I understand. Gratiana responded with a gulp. Despite understanding all of this, she wondered why there was no regret in her heart. Even though these esteemed elders berated Ray and his allies, she didn't feel the same as them in the slightest. She didn't regret bringing them to this place or helping them in any regard. Somehow, Gratiana was even taking their side in her mind whenever the elders berated them. Asm is more than just a filthy half-elf. Ray is nothing like what they call him. And as for Kara, she is a mere human, but she taught us a few things about the forest that will definitely be useful for avoiding predators without wasting mana on skills. She's a brilliant one. Yes, Gratiana still had her biases and considered elves to be a superior race, but she just couldn't think of the 3 acquaintances that she had just made to be filthy. She couldn't do it. Do you have any last words in your defense? Gratiana had a lot to say, including her current train of thoughts. She was still confused, due to the nature of her cognitive dissonance, and she so desperately wanted her sisters to understand it all. But there was no point. Just as she didn't bother listening to Aurora's reason for her offense all those months ago, no one would listen to hers. There's no point. Gratiana thought as she closed her eyes and parted her lips. I do not. All right. I think I've been patient enough. A rather distinct voice echoed across the room as someone emerged from seemingly out of nowhere. The eyes of all the elves widened as the individual made himself known in the esteemed Hall of the Elders, a place that no male had ever set foot in. A place considered sanctified by the elves? Yet, in just the blink of an eye, a human male casually stood there, right beside Gratiana, as he smiled at all the elves who watched in shock and horror. I don't believe I've introduced myself to you all. My name is Ray Skylar, and I come in P. Filthy human. How dare you? You dare set your foot on these holy grounds? AHH. How dare you, you pig? Nature's punishment be upon you, filthy heathen. Stay out of this, you beast. Know your place and return to your site of solitude. You ugly creature. That last statement struck a slight nerve in Ray's heart, but it wasn't like it showed on his face. Instead, he maintained his calm composure and pretended to ignore the elves and the insults they hurled at him. Even Aurora was pissed off at this point and was yelling at him, though with slightly less insults than the rest. Ray. You can't be here. Gratiana croaked as she looked at the figure beside her. His hand was on her shoulder, offering her the support that none of her sisters could grant her in such a turbulent period of her life. Some would blame Ray for her current predicament, but Gratiana knew she was the one who agreed to the bet. Hence, she naturally bore all the brunt of her actions and their consequences. Still, having him here, by my side, is assuring, she thought to herself with a slight smile. As soon as the High Elder noticed this, she shrieked and began hurling more insults and curses, especially towards Ray. Having him here, by my side, is assuring, she thought to herself with a slight smile. As soon as the High Elder noticed this, she shrieked and began hurling more insults and curses, especially towards Ray. Was this you? Did you seduce her innocent soul? Curse be upon you. Nature's punishment descend upon you, filthy heathen. Beastly worm. Child of wrath. At this point, due to all the shouts and screams, Ray could no longer take it. You. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, ensuring he maintained his calm facade through it all. Then. Shoo-yoo-oo. He undid his spatial layers. Chapter 639 Ray's Takeover. It only took 1 second. All of the elders who flapped their gums and opened their lips to utter words filled with bitterness and harshness without exception fell to the ground in that single moment. Aayaaaaangig. They jointly moaned as their weakened knees found their way to the surface that they stepped on. No longer could they form coherent words, or offer any scowl of resistance to the man who stood before them. An invisible force was making them submit, and they did so with full satisfaction. Gratiana, who was already kneeling, bowed her head as she felt herself reaching the pleasure that was denied her earlier. She thanked the benevolent one who was still beside her as she felt herself climax. She wasn't the only one, though. One after the other, the elves made absurd sounds, filling the sacred hall with noises that should never be associated with it. They all shivered, and in only a few more moments, they all began to experience the same high that Gratiana experienced. Why you? The High Elder was the only one who was still sane after all that pleasure, and while her face was beet red and her heart raced like crazy, she still managed to utter words. However, all of that changed when Ray took a single step forward. Ukiwoo. She let out strange noises and collapsed with everyone else. As the oldest in the room, she had been in the Oracle's presence more times than every other elf. However, it had been so long since she was called to their sanctuary that she had forgotten how it felt. But now, all of it came to her like a fresh memory. It almost felt like the very first time, the high and the pleasure at once, and that was more than enough to make her lose the final vestiges of her composure. Uayurg. The elves all passed out on the ground, soaked in both sweat and some sticky liquid they released moments before passing out. Ha! Seems I overdid it? Ray muttered to himself as he laid eyes on the women who lay at his feet. I never expected things to turn out this way when I first arrived in this continent, but I can't really complain about the effect I have on them. He also wasn't mind controlling them, so this had to be ethical. But damn! What a mess! As he uttered these words, Asm and Kara knocked and entered using the front door. Usually, it would be locked, but Ray already sensed their presence and unlocked it before they even knocked. Once they entered inside, they instantly stopped dead in their tracks and gawked at the several esteemed elders who were fully smitten by Ray's presence. This is too much. Kara covered her face as she blushed, her voice coming out in small squeaks. Agreed. Esm was far more composed than Kara, but it was clear that she wasn't without tension as well. After recovering from the sight, however, they ventured further into the hall and faced Ray, who just stood there awkwardly. So what now? Got any idea what the plan will be from this point on? Upon hearing Esm's question, Ray resumed his smile and put both hands on his pockets. He cast a side glance at the fallen elves and spoke. I think I'll just take over this community. There's no point in trying to hold myself back any longer, especially since this opportunity has presented itself. If he became their leader, they would have to give him everything he desired, which would in turn aid him in arriving at his goals faster. I could make the elves my allies. I could get a constant stream of resources for my business. In fact, the refinery being built will be pretty much guaranteed. Ray saw Kara's face light up the moment he said this. However, these two were only secondary to the most important goal he had at the moment. I need to see the Oracle. The fastest way he could think of in achieving that was by becoming an oracle in a sense. If he did so, leading the elves the way he saw fit, it would be inevitable that he got the attention of the oracle. If this oracle exists, and is real among the elves, it's only a matter of time before we meet. The morning sun hung in the air, shining its brilliant ray on the colorful and lush lands of the elven community. Silence usually started the mornings of the elves, a certain serenity that had become a ritual. On this particular day, however, such decorum was not observed. Several footsteps echoed within the community as they all trailed behind a certain man. All of the hundreds of thousands of elves within the community were walking behind him, though keeping a considerable distance from him as he walked behind the esteemed elders who were guiding him. Somewhere, a look of reverence and admiration filled their faces as the procession continued in full swing. Murmurs danced across the ears of the several elves as they leaked out hushed whispers about the man who walked before them. They knew who he was and where he was going. Ray Skylar was no mere human, so none of them shot him a look of contempt. The first time they laid eyes on him, they had made that fatal mistake. But no more. Their eyes were now open, and they could see him for the amazing being that he was. This went easier than I expected. Ray, being the center of all this attention, thought to himself as he kept his gaze forward and maintained his steady steps. Controlling the esteemed elders is one thing, but everyone else? Do I really smell that good to these people? Earlier that day, an announcement had been made to the elves about Ray's status, and by spreading his scent to the elves, he was able to display his authority over them. They all practically worship me at this point. He laughed to himself, noticing the looks of admiration he received from all angles. While he still felt somewhat guilty for using such a method, he didn't think much of it. He was very desperate, and he would do whatever it took to achieve his goals. I'll just try to get things over with as soon as I can. Chapter 640, Ray's Takeover. Right now, I'm heading to the shrine of the oracle. Ray's calm demeanor did no justice to the way he felt at the moment. He had only spent about 2 days in the land of the elves, yet he was already as close to accomplishing his goals as he possibly could. He tried his hardest not to be optimistic, but he couldn't help but be excited. If all this works out, I really have to reward Ader for showing me this way. He smiled to himself. Before this, Ray had no idea what to do. He suspected that he would have to wait months, if not years, before arriving at a proper answer. What about me, Master? You won't reward me? Of course, I will. You really did a good job in our short time here. Ray smiled some more, rendering genuine praise to the symbiote slime inside him. He he he. He 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 he. So far, so good. Thanks to my interference, Gratiana isn't going to be punished. She and the other young ones returned to the shore after the announcement. No one was harmed in the process of him arriving at his goal, and he felt oddly proud of that fact. And he cast his gaze to the esteemed elder who walked closest to him, and it was none other than Aurora El Slavere. It seems she doesn't remember me at all from the Carrie Blanc deal fiasco. That's good, I suppose. Ray didn't think it would make much of a difference if she remembered him or not, considering how much of a hold he had on all the elves at this point. But he was still glad that he was operating on a blank slate for the most part. I'm also curious about something. Since he was in a good mood, Ray decided to indulge himself by asking a question he hadn't seen anyone address yet. I've observed everyone in your community, and yet I see no males. He turned towards Aurora, who instantly gave him all the attention he desired. Do you have no males among you? His question only remained in the air for a few seconds before a reply came to him. Indeed. Only females exist among we elves? In fact, we had no idea of the existence of males until after our first contact with other races. Ray was stunned by the answer. It only made him more curious, hence prompting him to ask a follow-up question that anyone in his position would have asked. How do you mate, then? Mate. Ray swallowed hard as he sought a much better word to use to better structure his question. Reproducing, I mean. How do you reproduce if there are only female elves? He finally blurted out the question and awkwardly waited for an answer. When he first arrived and saw no male elves? A part of him suspected that the males were perhaps being held hostage in some sort of breeding facility to donate their seeds to the females for reproduction. But Aurora just disproved that. The elves can't lie to me, so I'm curious about how they are conceived. Or is their biology fundamentally different from ours? Ray was correct. The elven biology was indeed different from that of other races, but not in the way he would have imagined. Once a year, during the time of Ira native, a certain percentage of us grows certain genitalia. The same genitalia that are found in males of other races. As Aurora said this, her face grew pink, almost as if she understood the nature of the topic she was discussing with him. The fact that they were discussing this in public with Ray being an outsider made it even more awkward. Still, she spilled the beans. Those who develop those parts have the duty to insert and provide their seeds. And after that day, well, it's like this. Don't worry about it, haha. I think I get it already. Ray promptly replied, raising a hand as he laughed to hide how flustered he was. Oh damn. This is more surprising than what I expected. His suspicion of the breeding farm was even less shocking than what he was listening to. What Aurora was telling him, the secrets of elven birth, was practically something known as dick girls on Earth. I can't believe they exist in this world. And they're elves? He swallowed hard, deciding to bury the information in his mind. But, right as that thought was about to sink into the abyss, something popped into his mind. Does that mean that Esme also? Despite trying very hard not to imagine it, a cursed image with Esme having a slight bulge between her legs entered his mind. He instantly shook his head, nearly in tears as to why he would have such a thought. Ray reckoned the thought would haunt him forever if he didn't get the answers he needed. Do half-elves also experience this? He croaked out. What? No way. Only pure elves are capable of such. Aurora instantly responded, almost as if she was slightly offended about Ray's insinuation. It is a gift of nature that only we enjoy, one of the many reasons we are special. Ray nodded as she spoke about their condition with such pride. He didn't know if he was the one being a jerk due to his own understanding of girls and reality, so he decided not to think too much of it. I think some people are into that stuff too, so. He shuddered slightly while maintaining his casual smile, hoping to end the conversation as quickly as possible. Noted. Thankfully, his trick worked, and Aurora returned her attention to the shrine, which was already in sight. I guess I now have another reason to be happy that Esme is only half-elf. He smiled, finally deciding to throw all of the cursed information he just received into the farthest recesses of his brain. That way, he wouldn't look at the elves in a different way. I wonder what Esme is up to right now. She wanted to sit this one out, so she should still be back in our lodge. Thankfully, when he thought about her this time, there was no bulge to be seen. Chapter 641, The Executioner. HAAA. Esme sat in a meditative pose as she closed her eyes, completely immersed in her practice of absolute concentration. Once again, she attempted to key into the connection that elves shared with the oracle, but felt absolutely nothing. She was getting increasingly frustrated, almost to the point where she began to think her identity as a half-elf was the problem. But Ader said I would be able to. Ader wouldn't make such an assertion without reason to back it up. That meant there had to be some way she would be able to connect to the oracle. Is there really a point, though? Ray is already on his way to the shrine, and he'll probably be able to connect to her without my help. Once again, she was the only one who had no real use among the members of the team. Even Emil had played a more relevant role than her, and she was inside Ray most of the time. I don't know anymore. She opened her eyes and gave a frustrated sigh, slowly rising from her position on the cushiony ground. Her room was a simple space that had a bed, sparse furniture, and nothing else. The entire lodging was made practically overnight, and while her dwelling was just adjacent to Ray's, the difference in quality between both was like heaven and earth. It's clear that the elves are still hostile towards me, even if they revere Ray. She sighed. Esme knew she could always report the matter to Ray, and he would instantly take her side, but she really didn't want to burden him with more things. He already had more than enough worries on his shoulders, and bothering him about her problems would be insensitive of her. Their actions are harmless at most. She smiled, though not completely believing the thoughts she just rendered to herself. After standing in the room for a few seconds, she realized there was nothing else for her to do. I'm bored. I should have gone with Ray too. Boom. In an instant, before Esme could conclude her thoughts, a roaring explosion consumed her entire room, destroying every single thing inside. Plumes of smoke, and a raging inferno drowned every single remnant within until there was nothing but ashes left. Everything remained invisible, buried under the thick smoke and dust, and it was also covered in a particular barrier that shielded the blast from everything else around. As such, no one would be able to hear the explosion or even see the destruction. At least, not until it was too late. He. Did we do it? I think we did it. Finally. We killed her, right? The half-elf vermin. She's finally dead. Lord Ray will finally be free of her blight. These voices were from none other than young ones, elves who were yet to reach the age of maturity, as they stared at the thick smoke and violent flames that dwelled in their barrier. A total of 50 watched this with brilliant smiles on their faces, completely certain that their actions were for the greater good. The elders are all afraid of taking responsibility, but we won't forget nature's teachings. One of the elves grinned as she raised her fist in the air. She seemed like their leader, and while she was a young one, she had a rather mature look compared to the rest. Her long, blue hair danced with the wind as the rest also raised their fists to mimic her. Their excitement was born out of innocence, though their actions bordered the realm of catastrophe. After all, they had no idea what they had just done. Boom. In a mere instant, the barrier they created around the explosion shattered apart. As soon as it was blown into bits, the previously optimistic elves gasped in shock as they looked at the cause. The barrier was strong enough to hold the explosion caused by a combination of their magic, hence for someone to break through it, they had to generate more power than the might of half the elves present. No matter how powerful an half-elf was, such power from one so young was unexpected. Unless... You people. What the hell? As this voice echoed from the depths of the smoke, the unharmed figure of Esme proceeded out. She had a deep frown on her face, and her face shone with bright blue fury. What do you think you're doing? Her voice trembled slightly, almost as if she was about to cry. Despite her expression showing rage, her eyes had sadness written all over them. What do you think? Getting rid of an abomination like you. You shouldn't exist in this world. Your death is the only way to appease nature and restore order. The elves uttered these harsh words without regard for the consequence associated with them. They prepared themselves for a fight, all of them taking their They prepared themselves for a fight, all of them taking their stances and readying their mana. There was no hesitation in their eyes at all. These people. Esm's thoughts trailed as she spread her senses to the area around her, wondering if they were the only ones present. Sure enough, they weren't. The others aren't making a move. Is it because they're elders and will be held responsible? Ah. I see what's happening here. A wry smile formed on her face and she deeply exhaled. The elders are somehow hoping these young ones can eliminate me, hence creating the best case scenario. Esm nearly laughed at their foolishness, even though their actions caused a sharp sting in their heart. If they do succeed, do they really think they will be spared by Ray? As someone who knew Ray well, she wondered what he would do to the elves young or old if they managed to actually kill her. A part of her even wanted to give them a chance. Just to satisfy her curiosity. But, she decided against it. I can't afford to die. At the very least, for their sake. Raising one of her hands, she decided to use a skill she didn't particularly like utilizing due to its nature. Chapter 641 The Executioner. HAAA. Esm sat in a meditative pose as she closed her eyes, completely immersed in her practice of absolute concentration. Once again, she attempted to key into the connection that elves shared with the oracle, but felt absolutely nothing. She was getting increasingly frustrated, almost to the point where she began to think her identity as a half-elf was the problem. But Ader said I would be able to. Ader wouldn't make such an assertion without reason to back it up. That meant there had to be some way she would be able to connect to the oracle. Is there really a point, though? Ray is already on his way to the shrine, and he'll probably be able to connect to her without my help. Once again, she was the only one who had no real use among the members of the team. Even Emil had played a more relevant role than her, and she was inside Ray most of the time. I don't know anymore. She opened her eyes and gave a frustrated sigh, slowly rising from her position on the cushiony ground. Her room was a simple space that had a bed, sparse furniture, and nothing else. The entire lodging was made practically overnight, and while her dwelling was just adjacent to Ray's, the difference in quality between both was like heaven and earth. It's clear that the elves are still hostile towards me, even if they revere Ray. She sighed. Esm knew she could always report the matter to Ray, and he would instantly take her side, but she really didn't want to burden him with more things. He already had more than enough worries on his shoulders, and bothering him about her problems would be insensitive of her. Their actions are harmless at most. She smiled, though not completely believing the thoughts she just rendered to herself. After standing in the room for a few seconds, she realized there was nothing else for her to do. I'm bored. I should have gone with Ray too. Boom. In an instant, before Esm could conclude her thoughts, a roaring explosion consumed her entire room, destroying every single thing inside. Plumes of smoke, and a raging inferno drowned every single remnant within until there was nothing but ashes left. Everything remained invisible, buried under the thick smoke and dust, and it was also covered in a particular barrier that shielded the blast from everything else around. As such, no one would be able to hear the explosion or even see the destruction. At least, not until it was too late. He. Did we do it? I think we did it. Finally. We killed her, right? The half-elf vermin. She's finally dead. Lord Ray will finally be free of her blight. These voices were from none other than young ones, elves who were yet to reach the age of maturity, as they stared at the thick smoke and violent flames that dwelled in their barrier. A total of 50 watched this with brilliant smiles on their faces, completely certain that their actions were for the greater good. The elders are all afraid of taking responsibility, but we won't forget nature's teachings. One of the elves grinned as she raised her fist in the air. She seemed like their leader, and while she was a young one, she had a rather mature look compared to the rest. Her long, blue hair danced with the wind as the rest also raised their fists to mimic her. Their excitement was born out of innocence, though their actions bordered the realm of catastrophe. After all, they had no idea what they had just done. Boom! In a mere instant, the barrier they created around the explosion shattered apart. As soon as it was blown into bits, the previously optimistic elves gasped in shock as they looked at the cause. The barrier was strong enough to hold the explosion caused by a combination of their magic, hence for someone to break through it, they had to generate more power than the might of half the elves present. No matter how powerful an half-elf was, such power from one so young was unexpected. Unless... You people. What the hell? As this voice echoed from the depths of the smoke, the unharmed figure of Esm proceeded out. She had a deep frown on her face, and her face shone with bright blue fury. What do you think you're doing? Her voice trembled slightly, almost as if she was about to cry. Despite her expression showing rage, her eyes had sadness written all over them. What do you think? Getting rid of an abomination like you? You shouldn't exist in this world. Your death is the only way to appease nature and restore order. The elves uttered these harsh words without regard for the consequence associated with them. They prepared themselves for a fight, all of them taking their stances and readying their mana. There was no hesitation in their eyes at all. These people. Esm's thoughts trailed as she spread her senses to the area around her, wondering if they were the only ones present. Sure enough, they weren't. The others aren't making a move. Is it because they're elders and will be held responsible? Ah. I see what's happening here. A wry smile formed on her face and she deeply exhaled. The elders are somehow hoping these young ones can eliminate me, hence creating the best case scenario. Esm nearly laughed at their foolishness, even though their actions caused a sharp sting in their heart. If they do succeed, do they really think they will be spared by Ray? As someone who knew Ray well, she wondered what he would do to the elves young or old if they managed to actually kill her. A part of her even wanted to give them a chance. Just to satisfy her curiosity. But, she decided against it. I can't afford to die. At the very least, for their sake. Raising one of her hands, she decided to use a skill she didn't particularly like utilizing due to its nature. Chapter 643 Glass. Was that Esm just now? Kara appeared among the elves, clearly aware of their deep glare as she spoke and entered their midst. She flexed her glasses a little as she looked around her. And this destruction. This was her residence, was it not? What happened here? The elves completely ignored Kara as they went on to pick their comrades, first the youngs, and then the elders who couldn't stand on their own. I'm asking for an explanation here. She yelled out, fuming as she folded her hands. Shut up, filthy human. Kara's gaze shifted in the direction of the elf who spoke up first. The older-looking lady shot her a disdainful look as she spoke up some more. "Can't you read the room?" The girl laughed a little sheepishly as soon as she heard that. Humans and their beast-like intelligence. Murmurs began to leak out of the lips of other elves, and Kara found herself looking in the direction of each word. She focused on the lips of the elves, taking in insult after insult. "She has no idea how badly she stinks. Just leave us alone already. We don't need the likes of you here. We have nothing to say to you." After the elves were done with their first round of insults, all of them now standing still as they stared at Kara with sheer animosity, it was her turn to respond. "Ha! My bad." Raising her hands in the air, she sighed softly. In one of her hands was a vial, and the moment she raised both hands, the object slipped from her hand and fell to the ground. The glass vial shattered. Then, its forbidden contents spread out and covered the area in no time at all. Loud moans instantly filled the air as the elves all crumbled to their knees, all of them growing weak due to whatever Kara had them inhale. "It's my bad for trying to reason with you lot like sensible people and not the animals that you are." Kara slowly took off her glasses, revealing less of the submissive shy persona she had been displaying all along, and more of a certain kind of person. Her gaze was stone cold, and her demeanor was completely stern. Stupid animals that have no idea of their actions, the repercussions they cause, and the spiraling effects those will lead to. Kara sighed once again, suddenly possessing two vials of the very same glass in her hands. "It's a good thing I captured Ray's scent and mixed in a highly addictive component from the flowers from the dungeon to make the effects stronger." She only had a handful of the vials, but Kara reckoned that they would be more than enough to serve her purposes. "I didn't want to have to use this, but it seems this is all you can respond to." Upon seeing the vials, the elves began to drool as they weakly stretched out their hands. Their eyes were desperate, yet their bodies refused to listen. "P please. Mercy. Weary sorry. Please. J just a whiff. Please. I'll do anything." Kara smiled as she watched them, her lips slowly parting as she whispered the words, "Anything." They all nodded like obedient dogs, their tongues out as they completely submitted to her power. "I should feel bad for this, but there's no room left in my heart for empathy. Especially towards people like this." Kara only pretended not to know what happened to Esm, as she had been observing everything that happened from the start. She even saw when the young ones arrived to assassinate Esm, and she could have stopped it at any time. But she didn't. Why? Master Ader knew this would happen. And he specifically told me not to act. I certainly hope all of this works out well. She felt bad for Esm, but she also understood that the girl had to see the elves for what they were. Sometimes, changing the hearts of people just couldn't be done. Perhaps Esm just had to learn that the hard way. And I guess there's a lesson that should be learned by me too. I really should start wearing Ray's scent as a perfume, but wouldn't that be weird? A slight hint of pink covered her cheeks as she slowly shook her head. No. No, it's not weird. This is work-related. Upon telling herself this, she further reminded herself of her mission in the land, the one she had been given from the very beginning. Master Ader wants to permanently colonize these people for Sir Ray. They will be perpetually useful to him for any purpose he requires. Her mission was to secure every asset and lay the groundwork for a lot of the methods he would employ to make that a reality. Master Ader will take care of the rest, but I suppose I have to play my part for now. Getting the refinery up and running was an essential part of it, but that was only the beginning. According to Ader, there was no need to rush into things, and Ray was probably going to suggest some of those things himself. All I have to do is follow my orders. For the sake of my job. Now returning her attention to the elves, who were now crying and begging for more like little children, Kara's smile widened even further. I'll be asking you some questions, and if you answer them well, I'll reward you with some of this goodness. If you do not, then you'll never get this pleasure again. Understood? Yes. Yes, understood. Understood perfectly. All the elves nodded and prepared themselves to respond truthfully to any and all of Kara's questions, just as she intended from the start. I guess I can start now, pending the time Ray and the esteemed elders return. There's a lot I'm curious about, but I should also be able to uncover more beneficial information for the cause if I let them run their mouth on a bunch of other things. Kara brought out a notebook from her pocket and opened the pages where her questions were inscribed in bold ink. Let's begin, shall we? Chapter 644, The Shrine. The elven shrine was an elaborate garden of beauty. It had a vast interior, with flowers decorating multiple ends. The entire space seemed to have been made of flowers, and the amazing aroma that filled the air within its embrace added a more natural feel to its interior. From the compound alone, it was obvious to the eyes that this was hallowed ground. The cobblestone path that led to the entrance was immaculately woven, chiseled to perfection, so that all those who approached the shrine came with the utmost impression of the place. There were lakes on sides of the cobblestone path, almost making its surface similar to a bridge, at least, in terms of aesthetics. Then, the interior made purely of aged stone and flowery materials was another realm on its own. It had multilayered colors, thanks to the ambience of the flowers and also the varying tiny lights that illuminated the enclosed space. There was no window in the shrine, neither were there any sources of ventilation. As a result, without the small balls of light akin to dancing fireflies as well as the brilliant gems that decorated the ceiling, the place would be a completely dark void. It's cool for a place without ventilation, Ray thought to himself after admiring the beauty of the shrine that he now entered. He felt it could be the effect of some elven magic, but he sensed no cluster of mana anywhere. It didn't seem to be magic at work, so he figured it had something to do with the statue that stood a considerable distance from him. That is. His eyes narrowed as he observed the life-sized figure of an elf with 6 arms. 2 arms carried something similar to a planet like Earth, or perhaps this world. 2 of the arms held a staff, almost as if bequeathing it to another. And finally, the last set of hands had their palms clasped together in what appeared to be prayer. The statue was perfectly sculpted. If not for its faded ashen color, and lifeless state, Ray would have almost thought it was alive. 6 hands too, huh? Is that how the oracle looks like, or is it symbolic? He was beginning to regret not asking more questions prior to this moment. Realizing how his excitement made him careless, he decided not to make the same mistakes again. In any case, I'm finally here. He smiled, taking in the ambience one final time as he approached the statue with as much deference as he could muster. He was the only one within the shrine, as the rest of the elves were waiting for him outside. Ray reckoned most of the crowd would have dispersed at this point, with only the elders waiting for him to be done. Ha! Taking in a deep breath and exhaling it almost immediately, he closed his eyes and did his absolute best to strengthen his concentration and connection to everything around him. Greetings, Oracle. As soon as he said those words, echoes of his voice danced in the air. It would have startled him if he wasn't intentionally placing all of his emotions in check. My name is Ray Schuyler, and I desire an audience with you. I pray to you, with the appeal of nature, to grant me your presence. He bowed his head humbly, even going down to his knees. Ray was ready to do anything it took to see the oracle and get their blessing. There was nothing like pride when it came to getting what he desired. I am an otherworlder, O Oracle. My allegiance is not with the humans, and therefore I do not associate myself as a beast of sorts. I have allies like myself who came from another reality to this place, and right now, one of them has fallen under a curse of this world. Ray had debated whether or not to reveal his identity as an otherworlder to the Oracle, but after considering it heavily, he decided that it was ultimately the best approach. I need to do everything I can to gain their attention. I don't care what I have to say or do to get to that point. For Ray, telling the truth was the most compelling thing he could do. I need you to help save her. Please, Oracle, grant me an audience with you so I may save my friend. He yelled out. There was no response. We were summoned to this world to eliminate the dragons. It is to my understanding that dragons are the enemies of your people as well. The girl who has fallen under this curse is incredibly powerful, and we might not be able to take the dragons down without her assistance. We need her. We need you. Despite going a step further, not only to gather sympathy, but to provide proper utility for the Oracle's intervention, there was still no response. Ray began to grow frustrated, and understandably so, but he sucked it all in and decided to be more patient. Please, Oracle. If you desire it, I will leave your land as soon as you grant me this audience and hearken to my desires. I am willing to do anything for your aid. Of course, by anything, Ray had certain caveats in mind. Still, all of those could wait until he got the audience. Unfortunately, no response came to him. So that's how you want to play it, huh? Very well. Ray smiled internally as he steeled his heart. Let's keep going at this. This is useless. I've tried everything, but it's either I'm being ignored, or there is no Oracle here. Ray almost sighed in exasperation, but he had to watch his behavior in front of the statue. There was still a chance that the Oracle was listening to and watching him. You. Very well. He rose to his feet in a soft and gentle manner. I suppose I will return later for another round of prayers. The elves told me that the Oracle doesn't often respond to their prayers, so I guess I'll just have to be a bit more patient. As Ray turned back, he suddenly felt a wave of energy fill the room. Bwoosh. Instantly, his eyes widened and he swiftly turned to face the statue that stood still within the room. He froze at what he saw. Damn. Asterisk. 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 Thanks for reading. Is the time here? Is his meeting with